Hello, Sploresville. I can't seem to kick this cold, and it does seem like something's going around these days. It got chilly last night, didn't it? Temperatures well below zero, so that this morning when Antonio Juarez went out for a walk, that pond next to the water tower was chirpy. You all might know Antonio as Doc Juarez, the veterinarian that's got a practice down on Oak Street, but I know him, and my generation knows him as Weezer. He'll kill me for telling you this, but he got that nickname years ago, the first and only time that he tried marijuana. We were all at Jim Dowling's parents' house who were out of town, and someone rolled a marijuana cigarette a bit too tight and passed it over to Antonio to start it up. Now, he didn't know what he was doing, and that thing was rolled so tight, so he was just sucking and sucking, and he sucked it clear down into his throat and coughed it back up. Covered in saliva. Needless to say, nobody wanted to try it after that, but that was years ago. Now Antonio's a pretty sober man. He goes down to that pond quite a bit, the one next to the water tower, and he's remarked to me a couple times that he thinks of them as reflections of each other, sort of like a tree in its roots, except made out of water. But he feels a bit uncomfortable with the idea of so much water in that water tower being suspended so high in the air. And this morning the pond was chirpy, which meant you could take a small stone and almost skip it across the top of the ice, and it would make a kind of sound as it moved across the pond. Now, to Antonio, this was a further discomfort, because he figured that somehow the ice had suspended itself over the water of the pond and created some kind of an echo chamber underneath, and he wasn't sure what branch of science was responsible for this wonder, but it ought not to be. A chirping pond is an unnatural sound, and the only other time that he'd heard a sound like that was when he saw one of those Star Wars movies, where it was the sound that accompanied laser fire. He had heard that the way that they got that sound was by tapping on one of those diagonal tension wires that held up telephone poles and putting a microphone to it. To Antonio's ears, though, it wasn't a pretty sound. It was the sound of something under great strain, sort of like the wheezing of a dying dog. But he was not someone to be afraid of the uncomfortable. He let it linger in his mouth, and on his drive home, he kept making the sound as he rounded the corners. It provided a sound effect when he hit that ice patch and lost control of the car, and everything in his windshield kind of became a blur as he spun. The word coffee came into his mind as time slowed down, as it does when you don't know if you have much of it left. Coffee was the answer to a trick question that he'd been asked years ago when he was on a river camping trip on the Penahobich River, which was affectionately known as the Bitch. Before they left, Tom Stolman, who was leading the trip, asked them, what was the first thing you should do in an emergency? A number of ideas came from that group of teens. Antonio was impressed by Isabel Lasada when she said send up flares, which was a great idea, except for the fact they didn't have any. Leon Cornelius suggested that everyone drink their own urine, following it up with the fact that you could do that a number of times before you died as rationale for the action. That's when Tom stepped in and said coffee. You stop and you brew coffee. This advice sounded very wise and also very confusing to a group of teenagers, none of which drank coffee. And from that day forward, that group of teens, including Antonio, had a special reverence for coffee, assuming that it was imbued with some sort of a superpower. But as Antonio looked back on his life, his car now in its third full rotation, he realized that he hadn't been in any emergency situations that afforded him the opportunity to brew a coffee. And this was certainly no exception. But something about the violent, reckless spinning of the car and the absurdity of him trying to figure out how he could brew a cup of coffee at that instant put a smile on his face. And he still had that smile on his face when his car came to rest in that small triangle window formed by the tension wire coming down diagonally from the middle of the telephone pole. Now, I don't know why, but he told me that his instinct was to just get out of the car and pee his initials into the snowbank while making that sound. Some wonderful sketches have been submitted for the new school mascot, so many good ones, in fact, that we'll probably have to put them to a vote. We'll wait for tomorrow for that to happen. Leaving you with the Sploresville motto, let's find out.